The Lake Washington Ship Canal and Hiram M. Chittenden locks, known locally as the Ballard Locks, broke barriers in the Seattle landscape while connecting the rich resources of the lakes and surrounding areas to the Puget Sound. The impact of the canal and locks on the Seattle economy was great in the years after they were completed and continues to the present. Early settlers of the Seattle area discovered a trove of rich resources, but particularly timber and coal, but to their dismay, found transporting the resources very cumbersome. The many lakes, rivers, and streams and tide flats required goods to be transported across land to the next body of water, known as a portage, just as the native people of the area had traversed the land between the lakes and rivers using canoes for centuries. One early founding father, Thomas Mercer, made a suggestion in 1854 at the July 4th naming ceremonies for Lake Washington and Lake Union. The lakes could be connected for transportation using channels and waterways. One inspiration for this idea might have been the Erie Canal in New York, which was well known at the time and had been completed in 1825. 1864, the Seattle Gazette wrote an article that proposed building a canal by digging a ditch between the lakes and the canal will make itself. The federal government was also interested in building a canal from Lake Washington to the Puget Sound. In 1867, the Army Corps of Engineers surveyed the Pacific coast for military defense options and identified the Puget Sound as a possible site for a naval base. In 1871, another survey identified Lake Washington as a potential freshwater port with a canal to the Puget Sound. Seattle had begun growing as a commercial center with wharves, sawmills, small businesses, and factories, as well as a growing coal industry. In the summer of 1883, a group of investors formed the Lake Washington Improvement Company to build a small canal to transport logs and small boats. By 1903, a small canal with wooden locks had been built between Lake Washington and Lake Union and Salmon Bay. In 1890, Congress provided $10,000 to study the possibility of a larger canal. 5 canal routes were considered to connect Lake Washington to the Puget Sound, along the Black and Duwamish Rivers, Alexander's Tramway connecting Lake Union and Elliott Bay, Mercer's Farm Route connecting Lake Union and Elliott Bay, Salmon Bay through Shill Shoal Bay, Salmon Bay through Smith Cove. The Black and Duwamish Rivers route was not supported because dredging would have been too expensive. Alexander's Tramway and Mercer's Farm Route were no longer feasible due to extensive building that had taken place. The final 2 routes through Salmon Bay were considered most promising. Eventually, the Shill Shoal Bay route was considered most likely as the Great Northern Railway ran along the Smith Cove route, which would have encroached on their operation. The report listed several reasons why the canal and locks were needed. The canal would create miles of needed freshwater shoreline free from tides. Freshwater would also eliminate the dreaded shipworms or pterodos that destroyed docks and pilings in a few months' time. With the federal survey completed, Seattleites thought the canal was on its way, but in Pierce County and Olympia, opposition was voiced to the extent that Congress did not provide funding for a canal in 1892 River and Harbor Act. At around the same time, an alternate route for connecting Lake Washington and Elliott Bay was proposed. This route called for cutting through land south of downtown Seattle, known as the Beacon Hill area. So-called South Canal or Simple Canal route, named for its proponent, called for filling in the tide flats in Elliott Bay with the land removed for the canal. The route eventually proved unfeasible and primarily a scheme for filling in the tide flats. Eventually, the Chamber of Commerce and supporters of the northern route via Lake Union garnered enough public support. Likewise, it became clear that the southern route endangered the northern canal. In 1904, the Seattle City Council finally cut the water supply to the Semple Canal, which meant its end. In 1906, the Seattle entrepreneur and engineer James A. Moore proposed building a canal for $500,000 with 2 wooden locks suitable for small ships. The King County Commissioners approved the plan and preparations were being made for construction when in April 1906, Hiram M. Chittenden arrived in Seattle as the new head of Seattle District Army Corps of Engineers. Chittenden proceeded to study the planned canal and became concerned that the channel was too narrow and the budget was too small. He was also concerned that the wooden locks would deteriorate over time, with federal government inheriting an inferior facility. Chittenden's report from 1907 recommended masonry locks and a pair of large and small locks to be located in Salmon Bay, initially on the eastern side and later on the western Narrows end. By 1908, Chittenden's plan for the canal was approved. In the same year, Chittenden's poor health led him to retire from the Army Corps of Engineers. However, Chittenden continued his support for the canal as a commissioner with the Port of Seattle and through writing of newspaper articles. Finally, in 1910, the U.S. Congress passed the River and Harbor Act with an appropriation for $2,275,000 for Seattle Ship Canal to be built according to Chittenden's proposal. Work on excavating the Montlake Cut by Lake Washington had already begun in 1909 with state and local funds. In June 1912, realizing the need for a larger canal, the Corps of Engineers decided to excavate a larger cut measuring 2,200 feet long, 100 feet wide at the bottom, and 36 feet deep. Work on the locks themselves began in August 1911. First, a temporary dam was built around the site of the locks on the north side of Salmon Bay and Ballard. The lock pit was dredged and 2 gantry cranes were built to travel overhead. With the gantries, crews could easily move heavy loads such as concrete to any point in the construction site. In 1913 and 14, the concrete walls for the locks were poured. In the summer of 1915, the installation of the lock gates began. On February 2nd, 1916, water was allowed to float into the larger lock and the first vessel was allowed to pass through the locks. On July 12th, 1916, the spillway dam adjacent to the locks was completed and the locks gate could be closed. On July 25th, the elevation of Salmon Bay behind the closed locks had risen to 21 feet above sea level, the same level as Lake Union, allowing boats to pass through the locks to the lake. On August 3rd, the larger lock began operation. On August 25th, the temporary dam at Montlake was opened and Lake Washington began lowering to the level of Lake Union, which was 9 feet lower. By the end of 1916, an estimated 7,500 vessels, 12,000 passengers, and 201,000 tons of freight had already passed through the ship canal locks. On July 4th, 1917, the grand opening celebration for the Lake Washington Ship Canal and locks was finally held, with ceremonies and a parade of boats through the locks, Lake Union, and into Lake Washington. The construction of the Lake Washington Ship Canal and locks created both significant economic and environmental impacts. After the completion of the locks, commercial development around the area began to boom. The local and Alaskan fishing fleets were relocated to Salmon Bay, which soon became known as Fisherman's Terminal. Today, it's a tide-free freshwater location, reduces maintenance costs, and extends vessel life for approximately 700 commercial and 4,000 recreational vessels. For several decades, the canal area also became a hub for shipbuilding. Today, the Ballard Locks make this area a popular destination for recreational boating. The Ballard Locks are currently the busiest locks in the nation, with approximately 40,000 vessel transits per year. It is also the 12th busiest locks in commercial transits at 7,500 per year. The economic impact of the locks is estimated at $1.2 billion annually. The environmental aspects of the ship canal were also a significant factor, with the impacts still felt today. One of the most significant impacts was lowering the level of Lake Washington by 9 feet to the level of Lake Union. This created new land for development while also destroying marshlands and lakeshore habitats. The loss of the Black River was devastating for the native people who had used it for their livelihood for more than 10,000 years. Joseph Moses, a member of the Duwamish tribe and one of the last to live on the tribe's historic land in Renton, described the impact. That was quite a day for the white people. The water just went down, down, until our landing and canoes stood dry and there was no Black River at all. There were pools, of course, and the struggling fish trapped in them. People came from miles around, laughing and hollering and stuffing them in gunny sacks. Additional environmental impacts of the canal included valuable marshlands being drained, important lakeshore vegetation being destroyed, and salmon left to find new migration routes. Seattle's development, like much of the development at the time, was focused primarily on positive economic aspects of development. Many of the negative environmental aspects were not considered important at the time. Today, we have learned to weigh the environmental aspects as well as the economic aspects, so that entire habitats and cultural landscapes are not destroyed.